Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this SaRS Western Region first evening event for this year, although the year runs from September through to April, May, so not quite the normal calendar year. It's very good to see so many of you here. Thank you very much for coming along. If you didn't sign up on Eventbrite and you wish to be notified of future events, can you either see myself or Richard, who stood at the back, or Paul Short, who's waving his arms about there as well, and give us an email address so that we can contact you and notify you of future events. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Simon Whiteley, who's going to talk us through stamp, cast and accident investigation analysis.
Yes.
So Simon, thank you very much for coming.
Most welcome.
Over to you.
Thank you. Hi everybody. My name's Simon Whiteley. I'm a system safety engineering consultant based in the UK. I've worked as a system safety engineer across all parts of the engineering and product lifecycle, predominantly design and development and entry into service. Predominantly in the civil and defence aerospace, more defence than civil, looking at large multi-engine platforms, fast jets, helicopters, air traffic control, weapon systems, MBDA around the corner, defence maritime, defence nuclear, a little bit of nuclear weapons, not the weapons themselves but the training for safety cases, armoured automotive, healthcare and government IT, rail and pharmaceuticals, and then more recently developing into unmanned air systems, autonomous vehicles and a little bit of artificial intelligence, but I won't talk about that today. Now, I offer consulting, training, coaching and support regarding system safety engineering and safety critical project management, but my main sort of niche that I'm focusing on is bringing the stamp-based methods from academia into the mainstream, because I can see they're going to make a very positive benefit. As a system safety engineer myself, I understand the struggles and challenges we have with today's safety engineering approaches, and I've identified stamp as a significant opportunity, and that's why I've invested so much time and effort, as well as coming to speak to you tonight. I'm also a keen volunteer. I'm a bit of an aviation geek. I volunteered at the Royal International Air Tattoo at RAF Fairford for 11 years. I'm really passionate about aerospace, and that's really about me. So today's presentation, I've got a lot to get through, but I've got three very high-level objectives. The first is that I'd like to exercise your mind. As the saying goes, minds are like parachutes. They only work if they're open. I'd like to provide you a high-level overview with some sprinkles of detail, so there's an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I'd like to plant a seed in your mind. So as you go through this, as I say, think more broadly, think about how this might apply in the work that you do day to day and anybody else who it might benefit. So the objectives of the presentation: to recognise what is meant by STAMP, it's an acronym, what is meant by a cast analysis, appreciate the core process of a cast accident analysis, and appreciate how to apply cast as part of an accident investigation. Now, I'm going to do that through giving you a brief overview of STAMP and cast, and then I'm going to talk through a case study. And that case study, you'll be aware, is about a fan cowl door accident that occurred at Heathrow in 2013. And then at the end, the Q&A. Now, I'd like to promote as much audience interaction as I can. So if you do have a question, please stick your hand up, shout it out, let's hear it. And I'll try and address those as we go through. If I'm not able to address it at that point, I'll either address it at the end, or if you'd like to have a conversation afterwards, I'm quite happy to do that. Okay, so to give you some context, hands up who is familiar with this diffusion of innovation curve. Does it ring any bells? Does it make any sense? I've got a couple of people there. Okay. Well, essentially what this is showing is the curve of, essentially describes the theory of how, why, and how fast new ideas and technology spread. So in the very early days of any new idea, new technology, there are some very early innovators, pioneers, early adopters, and they like to try new things, they like to see what opportunities there are and take advantage of those. And then as time goes on, more and more people start to recognise this new opportunity and start to get stuck in and try it themselves. And then over time you get the early majority, the late majority, and then the very end, those that are generally risk averse or don't want to change, they don't like change. Now, STAMP is very much in the early phase, the early innovators phase. So there are people that are using it around the world in many different industries, but the usage of it is predominantly behind closed doors. And there's two main reasons for that, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. The first is that when you're talking about matters of safety, if you use a new technique and find what you did before perhaps was incomplete, or you've missed a few things, you don't really want to be screaming that from the rooftops, because that'll upset your customers and the general public. The second and most significant aspect is the huge competitive advantage the stamp-based approaches can provide you. And so if you get a good competitive advantage and save costs and save time and reduce risks, you don't really want to shout about that either, because all your competitors will jump on the bandwagon. So while you're an innovator, a pioneer, an early adopter, you can get the jump on everybody else. Now, in terms of sort of my mission, if you like, I mentioned I'm a system safety engineer. I understand the challenges that we all have with safety cases, safety assessments, and all of that kind of stuff. And I spotted STAMP as an opportunity to solve some of those problems, some of those challenges. And so my mission really is to try and drag the stamp-based approaches, STPA and CAST and all the others we'll talk about in a moment, from into the mainstream, from academia into the mainstream, so that you and your employers can really benefit from these. So over the last few years, you might be aware I've run quite a few webinars, done a few talks in various different places, and I've had interest from over 22 different countries from around the globe, various different time zones, from over 17 different industries. Now the bold industries you can see there, they're the industries that are really embracing this approach and really trying to practice it, learn from it, and get valuable results from it. Now in terms of the most emphasis, I would say aerospace, space and unmanned, they're really going ahead with it, but that's generally because those industries already have systems engineering embedded in their processes and how they do business, whereas the others are not necessarily as mature. Now, I'm going to talk about why we need STAMP, and then I'm going to talk about what is meant by a STAMP analysis. Because you hear a lot in the literature and a lot in the discussions, oh, I'm going to do a STAMP analysis, or I'm going to stamp this or stamp that. And it's a bit of an inaccurate description for what the activity is that people actually do. Hands up who's familiar with this relatively recent accident. So this is the Uber self-driving car accident that occurred in March 2018, so last year, that involved, unfortunately, a fatality. Now, this particular accident is one of the few that's been highlighted as being due to no failures. So the vehicle itself behaved as designed. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It detected the pedestrian. It classified her first as an unknown object, then as a vehicle, and then as a bicycle. So the car itself knew that that person was there, but it didn't apply the brakes. And there are a couple of reasons, technical reasons, why it didn't apply the brakes, which I'm not going to go into here. I'm just highlighting that this type of accident was not due to failures. It was due to the way the vehicle was designed and operated on the public road. Now, in this case, this is, hands up who's familiar with this particular case. Okay, so I'm not going to say too much about this one because obviously it's an ongoing investigation, but I believe this is going to be a turning point in the way that particularly civil air transport is regulated, the way that they do safety assessments, and how those safety assessments are signed off. Now, there are a number of issues with this. There were both technical, managerial, certification, and then operational from a pilot perspective. But these kind of accidents, it's never just one thing that causes an accident. We're pretty good from an engineering perspective dealing with failures, either engineering them out or engineering solutions to when failures occur. But this was a complex, dynamic issue with lots of issues all over the place. So there's a few challenges, and we have challenges with increased speed of technical innovation and the need to be first, which is what you want in business. You want to be first. There's increased complexity of systems and especially software, especially with the integration with the internet and Internet of Things, all of that great stuff. Increased connectivity, interdependency and interactions, and then significantly changes to human roles. So if you're familiar with human factors, human-centered design, You know, there's a move from having software or automation or artificial intelligence in charge of what traditionally would be under the control of a human, and we've essentially moved that human up the hierarchy away from that direct control, and that introduces new safety problems and increases the fragility of systems to not only human error in operations, but also human error in the design phase and requirements. And then we've got the concept of human errors being symptoms, not causes. Now, hands up who's sort of familiar with that sentence, or does that sort of ring a bell? Human error is a symptom of not a cause. Okay, great. So there is a change in emphasis from accidents that are due to plain failures, simple technical failures, to accidents that involve design behaviour, as you've seen a moment ago with the Uber example. Now, there are a few ways to deal with complexity. The traditional approach for dealing with complexity is what might be called divide and conquer or analytic reduction, if that rings a bell. So what we do is we think about the physical aspects, the functional aspects, and we divide them into distinct parts. And then we think about behaviour, and we divide behaviour into distinct events over time, or what you might be familiar with, chains of events. Then we analyse those parts separately and we combine the results. But by doing that, we make some really significant but subtle implications, especially when the system's really complex. And one of those is that we essentially presume that each part behaves independently, that when either individually or when combined as a whole with other parts, and then also that the parts themselves, their interactions and the events are not dependent on what are called feedback loops or non-linear interactions. So an approach to deal with complexity, it says a new approach, it's been around for quite a while, we use it as part of systems engineering, and that is to use systems theory or the process of synthesis. So we think more about the holistic, the big picture, as opposed to focusing on division. We think that everything is part of a system, however we define that system. So it's got a boundary, it's got some interactions across the boundaries. We think about components of the system and interactions amongst them, and we think about feedback loops and emergent properties. So this is where we start talking about STAMP. So when we say STAMP, we're referring to a label or an acronym that stands for Systems Theoretic Accident Model and Processes. So it's two broad things. And it originates from, hands up who's familiar with Nancy Leveson from MIT? A few people? Hands up who have no idea who she is whatsoever? A few people. Wow, more, that's great, okay. I'll let you find that out as your homework. So Nancy is a professor at MIT in the US. She wrote or devised the STAMP-based approaches and wrote about them in her second book, Engineering a Safer World. She's very kindly made that book available for free. So if you go to the MIT Press website, you can download that for free as a PDF and read it at your leisure. Myself and Nancy also did a YouTube video introduction, which you're welcome to watch at that link. I'll give you the links later on. But STAMP itself, so what is it? It's two parts. The first is it's an accident causality model or foundation upon which some tools are built. So we've got an accident causality model based on systems thinking, systems theory and control theory concepts, and then some analysis and design processes. So when we say we're going to do a STAMP analysis, I'm hoping you can see that that's not technically correct. We're going to be applying some STAMP-based analysis or design processes. So you might be asking, what is an accident causality model? Hands up who knows what an accident causality model is. One person, two people, one and a half people. Okay, great. So essentially, like any model, it is a paradigm or belief about how things happen, how accidents occur. And it underpins efforts to think about, design, discuss, manage and engineer for safety, but also how you investigate safety-related issues or accidents. And it's often not explicit or documented. Everybody has one in their mind, whether they realise it or not, and it influences the way that you think about safety and how you deal with safety problems. Now, you'll notice that I use square brackets, and I'm becoming quite famous for using square brackets, but essentially when I'm talking about a particular topic, a particular concept with a particular label, I'll use square brackets just to highlight that whilst it is English words, I'm referring to a specific concept, not just the general understanding of those English words. Hands up who's familiar with this? few more people. So this is Professor James Reason's Swiss cheese model. So in terms of accident causality models, this is an example. This is a common example that's used in a lot of places. So on the left-hand side, we have these the ideal defences in depth. So the principle is if you have lots of layers of protection, lots of defences in depth, then you shouldn't have any accidents and everyone will be safe. However, the reality is a bit different. We've got some holes in those defences, and generally these are referred to as the slices of Swiss cheese. That's why it's called the Swiss cheese model. So what you're doing is you identify some hazards, you put some defences in depth in the way, and essentially you're trying to protect or prevent assets and people losses or accidents. And that's generally the predominant accident causality model that you'll see everywhere, that is very big in health and safety. It is very big in air transport safety. And when I talk about an accident causality model, this is the one most people think of or refer to, but don't necessarily realise that's what they think about when you talk about accidents. Now, I've referred to that as the traditional view. So the realm of Swiss cheese, dominoes, and who's familiar with bow tie analysis? Excellent, we've got some bow tie people, brilliant. So the presumption is that accidents are due to chains of directly related events or due to breach barriers. Does that sound familiar to people? Excellent, okay. And essentially it defines safety as a management of failures problem. So you prevent accidents by identifying failures that you're concerned with and then either eliminating those failures or managing the failures or managing the results of those failures should they occur. In the context of the STAMP view, so the STAMP accident causality model, in contrast to the Swiss cheese model, accidents are defined as involving complex dynamic processes, and it defines safety as a dynamic control problem. So it's not just about failures. Failures can be dangerous, but not all failures are dangerous. But it also covers situations that are not failures that could be dangerous. And it essentially prevents accidents by enforcing what are called constraints or requirements. You might be familiar with the term requirements on system behaviour and interactions amongst system components using a control structure. Now, I've used a lot of sort of technical words there, and that's because the STAMP-based approach is based on systems theory and control theory, and that's where the language really comes from. So it'll be very familiar to systems engineers, maybe not so much to non-system engineers. And the STAMP-based approach is very much focused around this concept. So this is the concept of a control feedback loop. Hands up to see whether this is familiar to you. Does this look familiar to you? There's a few people there. Anybody it's not familiar to? No one wants to put a hand up.
In a different guise.
Say again?
In a different guise.
In a different guise.
We've seen it, but not quite.
Okay. Okay, well I'll talk a little bit about it just to give you a bit of an insight in that. So the basic intent is accidents are complex dynamic processes. So we think about managing safety by using these control loops. And conceptually, we have what's called a control process at the bottom. So this could be a physical process, it could be some equipment, it could be an organisation, it could be a team of people. It's abstract, it can be applied to anything like that. And that control process is under the conceptual control of a controller. And that could be hardware, software, humans, organisational, however you see fit in the context of what you're looking at. And it controls the process through what are called control actions. And when we're talking about what causes accidents, in the concept of STAMP, we talk about unsafe, in inverted commas, control actions. Now, when we're talking about accident investigation using the STAMP-based approach, we can't really use the term unsafe control actions because that implies judgment upon the actions of individuals that may have been killed. And so when we're doing an accident investigation, we want to avoid inappropriate judgment or biases. And so when we're talking about accident analysis using STAMP, we refer to what are called contributory control actions. Conceptually, they are the same, but when you're dealing with accidents, it's not really appropriate to use judgmental language. Now, there are four types, general types of contributory control actions. The first is a control action required for safety is not provided. And if you're familiar with the functional hazard analysis approach, that is very similar to loss of function. An unsafe control action is provided. A potentially safe control action is provided too early or too late, or at the wrong time or in the wrong sequence. So that's concept of timing and sequencing. And then we've got a control action required for safety is stopped too soon or applied too long. And that's about the duration of the control action. Does that make sense? Is everybody following that? Excellent. So once we've thought about the unsafe control actions, we then start to think about, well, how does that feedback loop contribute to enabling that control action to occur? And so we think about looking round the control loop, looking at the controller, these concepts called algorithm and process model, I'll come to those, and then the feedback. So the first is a control algorithm. So what's that? Well, conceptually, what that is a label for something that defines the behavior of the controller. So if you're driving your car, your control algorithm is how to operate your vehicle. You know, if you drive a manual car, how to use the gears and the clutch. If you drive an automatic car, the algorithm is your knowing what to do when you come to a stop and you don't sort of take your foot off the brake and it drives off on its own. The process model or mental model, if we're talking about a human, is essentially a model of what's going on in the control process. So it's essentially this is a representation of what's going on in this process. And it is based upon feedback. So feedback is provided to the controller, which updates its process model. The controller then uses that information and its algorithm to define how it provides control actions. Does that make sense? Is that excellent? Great. So once we've thought about one control loop, we then start thinking about looking at a hierarchy of these control loops. So this allows you to think about, physical processes. So if this is your brand new autonomous car, this is your autonomous AI controller, this is you sat in it's not a driver's seat anymore, so wherever you're sat in the car, and then above you it might be, the designer of the autonomous vehicle providing you instructions on how to operate the car. And these basic concepts of control loops and control structures enable you to model pretty much any system you can think of, whether it's computing or whether it's a social system, organizational, and it allows you to identify potential safety issues that you can then deal with. Now, one of the most powerful things I think about the stamp-based approach is the concept of these control structures, because it allows you to think about, this example is an air traffic control example, so it allows you to think about an aircraft and its trajectory, the aircrew on board, an air traffic controller, airport or ATC management, airline or operator, but it also allows you to think about the life cycle of the system. So the system designers, the assumptions that they make about the design, the operator, the maintenance structure, the emergency response structure, and then at very top, if you want to go that far, you can look at governmental, legal and regulatory control structure. So I'm hoping by now you can sort of see that you can use this for a very technical analysis of a complex system like a weapons system or an autonomous car, but you could also look more broadly at the social technical context and how these systems are operated. Hands up who can tell me which accident this relates to.
Tenerife.
It is Tenerife, yes. What made you see that was Tenerife?
Air traffic control, KLM aircraft.
Okay, yeah, excellent. So the first thing is this is just a very basic control structure, but you can see how much information you can cram in this just from a few boxes and a few arrows. Now this one's a bit fancy because it's got some colours and some dotted lines, but ultimately it's just some boxes arranged in a hierarchy with some arrows depicting feedback. So at the bottom here we've got the control process, the physical process, which is the trajectory, or more precisely keeping the trajectory of two aircraft away from each other. It's under the control of two aircraft and their aircrew, and then of course an air traffic controller at the top. Now this particular control structure shows two feedback loops between the air traffic controller and the aircraft. One is via the radio equipment and one is via visual feedback. So normally the air traffic controller can see out the window of the tower, but on this particular occasion, this particular airport was susceptible to significant fog that arrived very quickly. So all of a sudden you've got two huge 747s in the fog on the same piece of tarmac. They're talking on the radios, but you can't see them out the window. So the feedback to the air traffic controller is lost. And so you're essentially reliant on people talking over the radio to make sure that they don't crash into each other. And we know that that was unsuccessful. This is the same control structure, but exploded, just so that we can see the humans and the technology on the flight deck of the aircraft. So at the time this accident occurred in 1977, we had a captain, a first officer and a flight engineer, and they worked together to control the aircraft, to move the aircraft on the ground. And on this particular occasion, the first officer was the person talking to the air traffic controller on the radio, and at the same time the captain and the flight engineer were listening to the radio but not actually talking to the air traffic controller. And it appears from the cockpit voice recorder that the captain thought that they'd been given clearance to take off and that the runway was clear. This aircraft was still on the runway and then began to take off. Now the flight engineer, if you look at the transcript, the flight engineer actually heard the ambiguity in the radio transmissions and questioned, is this guy actually clear? And unfortunately there wasn't enough time to stop the plane and prevent an accident. This is the same control structure expanded even more, and this is based on information in the official investigation report. So we started talking about a very basic control structure, and we were able to ask some really serious questions as part of the investigation. And as we got more and more detailed, we were able to ask more and more powerful questions. And in this case, we've got the airport layout and layout map. Now, at the time this accident occurred, the airport that these aircraft were at were not used to dealing with such massive 747s. It was quite a small airport. And that airport on the day had problems with its airport lighting. So the air traffic controller couldn't flash the lights on and off to tell them to get off the runway. The airport layout, there was no signs to tell them which exit to take off the runway. And obviously when you're operating in fog in a 747, so high off the ground, you can't really see the ground very well. And if you need to taxi fast, you're not going to see the exit to get off. 747s are not sports cars, they do take a lot to turn. Now this is an example, I showed this earlier on, the people at the back probably can't see it. This control structure is an example for a Watchkeeper unmanned air vehicle accident that occurred at Boscombe Down in 2015. So this down here represents the actual air vehicle itself. This represents the telecommunications between the aircraft and the ground station. This is the ground station, the human-machine interface. These are the two crew. This is some flight reference cards, and then we've got the airport manager at the top there. Now, this just highlights, you can get a lot of information from this by looking at the technical aspects. So this particular accident, part of the cause of it was to do with what's called a pseudo weight on wheels algorithm. So this was very much a contributor to this particular accident. This one, which accident is this one from? Hands up, who thinks they know? Shout it out, let's hear you.
Oh, the collision over Austria.
Yes, it is. This is the Uberlingen accident. So we have a Boeing 757 and a Tupolev Tu-154 basically collided into each other, killed a lot of people. The aircraft were perfectly fine. There was no failures. Everything was fine. The pilots on this aircraft followed the procedures. The pilots on this aircraft followed their procedures. There was a few issues with the air traffic control above, but ultimately it was two perfectly serviceable aircraft with pilots doing the thing that they were supposed to do, and they crashed into each other. Now, between the DHL crew and the Bashkirian crew, the DHL air crew are told as part of their training that they must follow whatever the traffic collision avoidance system says. So the TCAS says go one way, they go that way. Whereas the Russian crew, as part of their training, they're told to do what the air traffic controller tells them to do. So the air traffic controller told them to take a particular evasive action, which was contrary to the TCAS. But their procedures, their rules were do what the air traffic controller said, which was contrary to TCAS, and they collided. It was very serious. Now we can look at this one even more. So it wasn't just pilots or aircraft or failures or anything like that. There were issues more deeper in the system. So in this case, we've got the actual air traffic control technology. So that includes radio communications, telephone communications, short-term conflict alerts. So they have a radar screen that tells them when aircraft are on a trajectory. We've got a radar picture. Now, on this particular occasion, there are two radar sectors. So this sector, this technology looks after this piece of airspace, and this sector looks after this piece of airspace. Now, normally, there will be two air traffic controllers, one for each sector. But on this particular occasion, this one air traffic controller was looking after both sectors. And this aircraft arrived, it was a bit of a disturbance, it was a late arrival, and it distracted this air traffic controller from looking after both of these sectors, and that's what contributed to him not seeing the aircraft on a conflicting trajectory. Now, there are many reasons why that was the case, but what I want to just highlight here is just by representing the control structure, you're able to see the difference between work as imagined, if that rings a bell, and work as done, how it actually is, how it's tolerated by the organisation. Now, this particular air traffic control organisation tolerated this operation for many years. So they were operating at increased risk for a long time before the slices of the holes in the cheese aligned and we had this accident. This is a more detailed version where you can look at the airport, at the ATC management, the technical management, and then the ATC authorities, and in this case the Swiss Federal Office of Civil Aviation. So you can go really far if you want to. You can be very detailed or very broad. It's entirely up to you.
Is there an easy way to read those? Is there like a red path of failure or anything on them? So if we got like the flight instructions, are they just the red paths?
Yes and no. Kind of.
Multiple.
Yeah, so for the sake of having lots to talk about, I use lots of dotted arrows and colours and all that kind of stuff. You don't need to do that. It can just be literally black and white, you know, boxes and arrows. But I do like to highlight, like in this case, you've got the control action issued by the air traffic controller via the radio channel to the Bashkirian aircrew, and that was you need to take this avoiding action. You then had the TCAS also giving a control action to the Bashkirian crew, but that was the correct control action. It was the valid, it was this one that started the problems, and then their actions. Because they received the control action from the air traffic controller, they started to enact that. The TCAS was basically shouting at them, you need to go the other way, and as the aircraft get more and more proximate, the TCAS gets a bit more assertive until, well, it's too late. So yeah, you can do that if you like. Now, I talk about control loops and control structure modelling as almost like a jigsaw. You're trying to look for the jigsaw pieces in the accident, the control loops, and you're trying to see how they fit together in a hierarchy. So it is really like trying to, you know, put a jigsaw puzzle together. But of course, this gentleman, George E.P. Box, you're probably familiar with him, maybe not. He's a world-famous extraordinaire statistician, and he said once, all models are wrong, but some are useful. You might have heard of that. No? Okay. But he also said that we need to remember that all models are wrong. The practical question is how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? So all I'm really highlighting there is that these are control structure models. They're not the real system. They're our understanding of the system, and they enable us to analyse these models and get valuable results. Okay, so what are the stamp-based processors? So I'm going to give you some bonus information here. I'm not just going to talk about CAST, I'm also going to talk about STPA. So there are technically 4 model-based analysis processors based on stamp. So when we say I'm going to do a stamp analysis, you can ask somebody and say, well, which one do you mean? Do you mean STECR, STPA, STPA SEC or CAST? Which one are you talking about? Now, STECR is what's called Systems Theoretic Early Concept Analysis. I'm sorry about the acronyms, I didn't choose them, they're a bit of a mouthful. But this is essentially applying the stamp-based approach during early concept analysis. Before you've got a design, before you've got a concept of operations, you can literally take a paragraph of text about what you intend to do, and you can start to iterate that using STECR to develop a more robust design, less risk design, very early in the concept stage. Then you've got STPA. So STPA is Systems Theoretic Process Analysis, and this is the hazard analysis approach based on STAMP. And this is used during the design phase. You can use it very early, you can use it very late, you can use it during system changes. So if you have an operational system and you want to make a change, you could use STPA. STPA SEC is basically a cybersecurity focused STPA. And then cast accident analysis, which we'll talk about today. And that stands for Causal Analysis based on systems theory. So this is looking at an event, an incident, a near miss, or an accident, so after the fact. Right then, so cast accident analysis overview. Hands up who do investigations as part of their work or have done it in the past. You do. Okay, great, excellent. So this is a very high level investigation process. So first you observe the accident scene or the situation that you're dealing with. You then document what you've seen, and then you plan, what are we going to do to investigate this? What resources do we need? What specialists? You know, if we're doing an aircraft accident investigation, we need to read the data recorders. We might need an engine specialist. We might need an aircrew specialist. You know, all of those things. And as part of that activity of doing an investigation, we will establish some facts. We will do some form of analysis, you know, maybe a bow tie analysis, something like that. We will establish some findings based on that analysis. We'll form some conclusions and we'll make some recommendations. Now, when we're talking about doing a cast accident analysis, we're referring to this phase, this part of the overall investigation process. So cast is not the investigation process, it is the analysis part of an investigation process. Does that make sense? Everybody, great, excellent, okay. Now, so as you get more advanced using cast, more experienced, you could actually use cast accident analysis to help you plan. So as you saw from that control structure model, when you receive the first information about an incident, you will start to build that control structure model, and that will help tell you what specialisms you need as part of your investigation. So if you see, in the case of the Uberlingen accident, the Russian air crew followed what the air traffic controller did, which was in accordance with their procedures. So straight away, as part of the investigation, you will know not only do you need a human factors person, you'll need somebody who knows about the airline procedures and how they flow down from the national regulator, if that makes sense. And then the bonus part is when you're making recommendations, you could use the STPA hazard analysis approach to make some very specific, powerful recommendations. But I'm not going to talk about that today because that's very detailed. We're going to focus on cast. So this is a hypothetical example, or just to show the proportion of unsafe contributory control actions to causal scenarios. So logically, there's going to be a certain number of control actions that relate to the accident, and then a number of causal scenarios that go with it. Now, as part of when an actual accident occurs, it will be some specific unsafe control actions and some specific causal scenarios. And that's what CAST focuses on. So it's not trying to identify all possible causes of accidents. That's what hazard analysis, STPA, is for. CAST only focuses on the ones related to the actual accident. Now, as part of the accident analysis, because of the systematic nature of CAST, you may also find other causes of that same accident that didn't occur on this occasion. But you also might find other causes of other accidents that you've not yet had. So it's very powerful in that respect. And the ultimate goal of CAST is to establish what was the control structure, so what was that control structure model that existed to enforce what are called high-level safety constraints. And these are the requirements or constraints that need to be enforced to avoid or prevent an accident. And then we establish how and why each level of the control structure allowed or contributed to inadequate control at that level. And then once we've done that, we can make some recommendations, suggestions for what changes to the control structure are necessary so that safety constraints can be enforced if they can. So in the case of the Uberlingen accident, retraining all of the Russian pilots to follow what the TCAS says versus what the air traffic controller says is obviously quite a large activity and will take a lot of time to implement. So you can be mindful of that. Okay, so this on one page is the CAST accident analysis process. It's just a quick and dirty overview. So the first thing we do is we document the losses, what's actually happened, what damage has occurred, what harm has occurred. Then we define the hazards related to those accidents or losses. Then we define what are called the high-level safety constraints, and they are the requirements necessary to prevent or control those hazards. Then we do some modelling, so we'll create a timeline of the accident if we have the information available, and then we create the control structure model. Then we do the analysis of the model, and that is done in 3 parts. The first part is the physical process, so what is the physical mechanism of the accident? Was it a failure? Was it an impact? Was it a loss of safe separation? Then we look at the control structure, and first we look at the components of that structure, whether it's hardware, software, humans, organisations, and then we look at the structure of that control structure and how that contributed to the accident, and then we make recommendations. And this is a more nice colourful picture version of it, just for those who like colourful pictures instead of lines all day. Excellent. Is everybody following where I am so far? Are we all? Great. So then, let's get on the case study. So the aircraft fan cowl door loss, London, United Kingdom, May 2013. So this case study is based on one source of information, which is the official investigation created by the Air Accident Investigation Branch. Essentially, and I'm not going to make you read all this, essentially an aircraft took off from London Heathrow Airport with the fan cowl doors on the engines unlocked. So as the aircraft sped down the runway, the airflow over the airframe caused the doors to open and essentially ripped off as the aircraft took off. And in the doors being ripped off, the right-hand engine suffered significant damage to the fuel system, the hydraulic systems, and the engine control wiring on the outside. And later, while the aircraft was flying around over London, a fire developed in the right-hand engine, which required them to shut the engine down. So we had a 2-engine aircraft flying in low over London with 1 engine, and then they fortunately safely landed at Heathrow and they put the fire out, everybody evacuated. In a nutshell, that's what happened. Now, when we go back to how the aircraft doors basically got broken off, the reason the doors were unlocked was because of a recent maintenance that was done overnight, literally the night before the accident. So 2 maintainers were tasked with doing what are called daily and weekly checks, and as part of the weekly checks they are required to, oh there we go, there's a nice picture there. So this is the fan cowl door, there's 2, one on each side of the engine, and they essentially open outwards, and you can see just about there at the bottom of the engine there is this thing called the integrated drive generator, and it has an oil level that they have to check. So during the nighttime maintenance they open the doors, they checked the oil level, it was low, but they didn't have the oil guns, the oil top-up tools to fill the oil up. So what they did, instead of closing and locking the doors, they left them unlatched, unlocked, just sort of closed. Now there is a procedure associated with opening and closing this, but because of standard practice at the airline, they just closed them, didn't lock them, for various reasons. So they then went off to complete the rest of their shift. They had a number of different aircraft to maintain. So the first aircraft was this one. This aircraft was the second aircraft. So they opened the doors but didn't close them and lock them. They went to this other aircraft, that aircraft, and then back to number 6. And then when they got to number 6, they, instead of going back to number 2, they drove straight past it to number 3, which was an aircraft they'd already worked on that night. Now there are a number of reasons why that was, but we'll come back to that. So this is a photograph taken at the same sort of time. So it was a nighttime maintenance operation, and those that are familiar with human factors and circadian rhythms, and that your error rate increases during the night. It was nighttime, it was dark like this. The aircraft serial number is printed on the tail, on the nose, and then on the landing gear door here. But the technicians were working on the engines, which, I mean, they're not massive aeroplanes, these, but they're not small. So they were quite far away from them. And they essentially went back to the wrong aircraft, this aircraft, checked this aircraft, opened the doors. They were a bit surprised to find that the doors were already locked. And they were thinking, well, that's a bit strange. Who's been and worked on this aircraft and kindly locked the doors for us? But they didn't sort of recognise that as a bit strange. They found that the oil levels were back within tolerances, as you'd expect, because it's a different aircraft. And then they went on their merry way, finished work, and then later on the aircraft was taken and they had an accident. So yes, now these photos were taken literally on the morning of the accident by somebody else working at the airline, and they were taking photos of the aircraft for some reason, and you can see quite clearly, I say quite clearly, obviously this crack is only like an inch, so if you don't know what you're looking at, like as a flight attendant or a tug driver, you wouldn't necessarily look at the aircraft and go, yeah, that fan cowl door is unlocked. And then the same here, you can see the two latches below the engine. As the aircraft took off, the fan cowl doors got ripped off. There was some leaking fuel, lots of screaming passengers. The aircraft took off in this direction, flew round, and then returned to Heathrow. The aircrew themselves didn't know what had happened, because whilst they were taking off, you might be familiar with the concept of a, what's it called, clear cockpit? No, not clear cockpit, sterile cockpit. So essentially during safety critical operations like takeoff and landing, the pilots should not be disturbed. They just need to operate the aircraft so they're not disturbed and cause an accident. And when they took off, there was lots of passengers telling the flight attendants, hey, there's something not right here. They tried to call the captain on the flight deck and they just ignored the phone because they were operating in a safety critical phase of flight. And it was only until later on, at this point, almost 5 minutes after takeoff, that they first talked to the senior cabin crew member and found out that there was a problem. And then they had another conversation, and then it was basically 11 minutes later when they realised there was a fuel leak. And then they returned to the aircraft. There was an engine fire warning on approach. They shut the engine down, and then they landed safely at the airfield. This is a picture of the evacuation. You know, top safety tip, don't take your bags when you're escaping from an aircraft. Somebody did. This guy up here nearly dropped his suitcase on a fireman. And this is a picture of the engine with the doors ripped off. So this is the right-hand engine. This was damaged the most. There was damage to the fuel manifold. That's where the fuel leaked from. That's where the fire started. And also the hydraulic leaks. Okay, so the foundation phase. I'm just thinking at the time now. Have we got time to talk about this too much? Okay. So I said at the beginning of the analysis process, you define the losses or accidents. And you think about, well, what are the outcomes? You know, the aircraft was damaged, there was a fire, there was a loss of fuel, there was lots of, potential for multiple deaths, a loss of the aircraft, multiple deaths, injuries on the ground if the aircraft came down, share price devaluation. So you'll notice this is not just about safety. If you want to go broader than safety, you can think about business operation effects, negative media coverage, brand damage, airport ATC disruption. And then we talk about defining a hazard. Now, hands up who's familiar with the age-old argument about what's a hazard and how painful that argument is. A few people. Okay, well, I won't go into it here. Those that don't know, you're lucky, it's great. So when we're doing a stamp-based analysis, and I need to emphasize this, when we're doing a stamp-based analysis, the concept of a hazard is different or more constrained than the concept of a hazard that you're used to dealing with as part of your safety assessments. I won't say too much of that now because we don't have the time, but I just need to highlight that. If people talk about comparing stamp-based analyses with other based analysis, just think in your mind, well, they've got a different definition of a hazard there, so we can't really directly compare them. So in this context, the hazard we're interested in the most is the aircraft was released for service in an unsafe condition. And that hazard in this context can be broken down into fan cowl doors not closed and secured for or during flight. And that has two high-level safety constraints. So these are the things that the control structure, those control loops, should enforce. So the control structure shall ensure that the fan cowl doors are closed and secured before flight, and then the fan cowl doors should remain closed and secured during flight. Now, the reason I've separated those out is because to secure the doors before flight involves some humans, but when the aircraft is in the air, to keep the doors secured and closed, there's nobody outside trying to hold the doors. It's going to be a technical mitigation, so you can start to think about aircraft design. Okay, so the ultimate goal, as I said, what was the control structure that existed to enforce the high-level safety constraints, and how and why each level of that control structure allowed or contributed to inadequate control at that level. So we do some control structure modelling. Now, I modelled 3 different control structures because this was quite a complex accident and I wanted to look at the different different aspects. Now, we don't have time to go into this in detail because there's so much of it, but this is the operations control structure. So I've got the 2 aircrew, the aircraft itself, the air traffic controller, airport fire and rescue services, the operator, British Airways, and then the maintenance organisation. Then I've got the maintenance control structure, which is what I'm going to focus on in a moment. So we've got the 2 maintenance technicians, we've got the aircraft, the technical log, the work allocation sheet, the aircraft maintenance manual, Airbus and International Aero Engines. We've got the maintenance management organisation, and then at the top, the regulator. And then we've got a design control structure. So this is about the design of the aircraft itself and why the fan cowl doors were designed the way that they were. And then the analysis phase. So this is where we get into the detail. So we're talking about this control structure, and I'm going to focus on these 2 technicians. So as part of the analysis phase, we do it in 3 parts. We look at the physical process, the components, and then the structure. As part of the physical process, clearly it's the engine, the fan cowl doors, the latches themselves. The latches, these are unpainted latches. They should actually be painted like this to make them more visible, conspicuous. So as part of the physical equipment analysis, what are we talking about? We're talking about the Airbus A319 fan cowl doors. There were some physical failures in that the doors detached, and also there was inadequate high visibility paint. There were some unsafe interactions between the unsecured doors and the airflow, some contextual factors, the doors were not secured and locked. A summary of the contribution of the physical, a summary of the role of physical components in this accident is that the fan cowl doors detached, impacting critical parts of the aircraft. So there are some unanswered questions. So in terms of the certification requirements, so these are the things that define how the aircraft should be designed and certified. The doors themselves were they were defined as structure of the aircraft, and that they must sustain all the flight loads. Now, clearly these doors didn't sustain the flight loads because they got ripped off. So straight away, there's some avenue of inquiry from a certification and technical design perspective. Then we've got the System Safety Assessment, CS 25-1309. So that is the requirement for doing a system safety assessment. In this particular accident, Airbus did not do that safety assessment, but it wasn't established by the investigation why that was. And then recommendations, so look at the certification and safety assessment, structural integrity, and crew alerting. So the crew, from a passenger door perspective, the crew would be alerted if the doors were unlocked, but these fan cowl doors, there is no crew alerting function. So then we look at the actual components in the structure. So any one of these items you analyse using this approach, and I don't know if you can see that at the back, that's probably a bit small. So there are essentially 3 phases to the component analysis. The first is to look at the requirements and control actions. So what safety-related responsibilities and safety-related constraints these people had. You know, what were the contributory control actions? Then we attempt to explain those actions or behaviours by looking at their mental model. We spoke about that earlier. Contextual factors. So what context were decisions made, and then ultimately what other questions should we ask as part of the investigation. So safety-related roles and responsibilities, they need to perform the daily and weekly checks in accordance with procedures. They also need to report anomalies to management. So if they identify an issue with whatever it is they're doing, they have a responsibility to report it back to management so that they can deal with it. In terms of control and feedback ability, so the technicians, they didn't have any physical issues, you know, they were not ill or anything like that. They were capable of securing the fan cowl doors, but in terms of control actions, they did not. They did not provide the control action to secure the fan cowl doors. The technicians also then returned to the wrong aircraft. So they were doing action on the wrong aircraft, not the one that they should have been working on. So what were their mental model? What was their process model for? Well, the main one is that they thought that they were working on the correct aircraft. They didn't realise they weren't working on the correct aircraft. So why was that? What are the contextual factors associated with that? Well, they had some disrupted activity. You know, so some of the aircraft that they were due to maintain didn't arrive on time because it's quite a dynamics operating environment. They were parked at different stands. The technical log, the aircraft log that defines the activities that's been performed to the aircraft, they were not actually on board the aircraft. They were removed for administrative reasons, so they didn't have that feedback of seeing the log on board the aircraft. Equipment availability, the IDG oil guns were not available at the time they needed them, and they were far away from where they were working, so they had to stop their task, go to a different part of the airfield and then return. Inadequate feedback upon returning to the aircraft, so when they returned to the wrong aircraft, it was not immediately clear to them that they were working with the wrong aircraft. And then fatigue, shift working, overtime. So there was not enough, well, there were a lot of maintainers in this operation, but they were doing a lot of overtime. There was a lot of work they needed to do. I think they'd worked something like 70 hours in the previous week, so they were pretty fatigued. And then in terms of the technicians, a summary of the role of that component in the accident. So the technicians did not secure the fan cowl doors. Some unanswered questions. Why did the technicians not verify what aircraft were they working on? That wasn't established as part of the investigation. So as part of our investigation, we go and interview people and talk to them. Why did the technicians not close the loop on who had completed their task? So when they returned to an aircraft to find it in a different state to what they left it, why didn't they follow up with management and find out, well, this is a bit strange, what's going on? And then make some recommendations. Now, due to time, it is getting quite on now, I'm going to move straight on to the structure analysis. So as I said, normally you would do an analysis of each of these controllers and then you move on to the structure analysis, but we don't have time to do all of that now. So this again covers 6 broad topics. So the first is, what structure, architecture and interactions contributed to this particular accident? So the technicians began the shift together, but due to the nature of the work, they had to later split into separate vehicles. So at the start of the shift, they were in the same vehicle. At the end of the shift, they had to go in separate vehicles because one of the technicians had to pick up some equipment from a different part of the airport while the other technician was doing some work with somebody else. The remote locations of equipment, responsibility for ensuring adequate control of maintenance per aircraft was inadequately allocated and performed. And what I mean by that is they had the 2 LMA technicians, but also a licensed engineer working on the aircraft, doing different tasks, but they weren't coordinated together. Communication and coordination. So the technicians, engineers, maintenance, management staff, so they only really talked to each other when they went back to the crew room, not necessarily part of the tasks. Dynamics and changes, evolution. As I mentioned, the technical log is normally on board the aircraft when maintenance is done, but for administrative reasons it was removed from the aircraft and taken back to the maintenance office, which was like a 15-minute drive away from the tasks that they were doing. There were changes to the maintenance task list due to aircraft arrivals and delays, unexpected maintenance tasks. So the reason they had to open the fan cowl doors was to check the oil levels. But every time, well, I think it was 3% of the times that they do this check it's only 3% of the time they need to check the oil. So they don't, to change the oil. So they don't normally carry the oil filling equipment. It's only on the rare occasion. Okay, so in terms of the safety management system, so the SMS, we talked about fatigue risk management. There was no fatigue risk management effort required or implemented. It was all down to the European working time regulations. Then the equipment availability. Aircraft released to service post-maintenance. So when the work had been done on the aircraft, how that aircraft is handed over to the pilots was not looked at in any detail. Safety information system. So it's apparent that working on the wrong aircraft had happened quite a few times in the past, but it was not made available to management, so they didn't know it was a threat that needed to be dealt with. The work being completed by others, that was also quite a common occurrence, but it wasn't reported, so they didn't know about it. And then safety culture. So, as I mentioned, anomaly reporting, work being completed by others, closing the loop on that, and then procedure compliance. So they left the aircraft in an unsafe state, which was contrary to procedures, but that was normal practice at the airline at the time. And then contextual factors. So I've mentioned overtime working. So summarising the role of the structure in the accident then. So availability of equipment and technical logs, along with unexpected servicing activity, contributed to the technicians completing tasks on the wrong aircraft, and then some unanswered questions. Why were the technical logs removed from the aircraft? So in a nutshell, that is a very fast, very rapid cast accident analysis. Now, we haven't got time to do the analysis operations phase. I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if you like. Yes, sorry, just so before the aircraft goes flying, the aircrew is supposed to do a crew walk around. But the nature of these locks, these latches, is very close to the ground, and it's very difficult for people to actually see. Now, at the time this occurred, the pilots are trained to do the walk around once when they start at the airline, and this particular pilot that did the walk around was trained 7 years prior to do the walk around, and as part of that training, it wasn't highlighted the importance of checking that the fan cowl doors are latched or what the latches even look like. So the person doing the walk around couldn't have done an effective walk around because they weren't adequately trained. Okay, so we could talk about the design phase, we don't have time. So in summary then, so the immediate cause as stipulated in the investigation report was that the fan cowl doors were not closed and secured following maintenance activity, such that the aircraft was in an unsafe condition for flight. The main causal factors were that the technicians did not comply with the procedures, the fan cowl doors were left in an unsafe condition following overnight maintenance, aircraft was signed off as serviceable, pre-departure walk-around inspections did not identify fan cowl doors on both engines, were unlatched. So that's just 3 causal factors. How many did we speak about over the course of the last sort of hour? It was many more than that. Contributory factors, so the fan cowl door latching system design, so the latch positioning on the bottom of the engine. Reduced conspicuity of the latches, so the high visibility paint finish was chipped off. The technician's decision that further reduced the conspicuity of the latches. So by that I mean that when they closed the fan cowl doors, they didn't lock them. As part of the procedure, they don't lock them, but they arrange them in such a way that those latches stick down further. But because they didn't, you couldn't see them very well. So there were some recommendations. There were 3 for the European Aviation Safety Agency looking at fatigue risk management, Airbus in terms of a door latch, unlatch warning, and then also to include fan cowl doors in the system safety assessment. So that's the design aspects. BA to amend training, because training is always the first thing everyone goes to. And then also to review evacuation procedures. Now it's important to understand that as this investigation was ongoing, the airline was obviously making safety changes. So when you do your investigation, it's not necessarily of the system that existed at the time your accident occurred. Some recommendations, so pre-flight walk-around inspection effectiveness, post-maintenance inspection effectiveness, specific maintainer training, tasks and fatigue, stop removing technical logs from the aircraft, change the maintenance shift tasking and organisation to ensure appropriate coordination amongst maintainers, adding a lockout tagout lanyard to the flight deck, so like a big sticker on the dashboard that says this aircraft is under maintenance, implement maintenance shift changes to manage fatigue, and then obviously passenger evacuation with luggage, personal belongings. That's always a big one. So some unanswered questions. Technician behaviour upon finding their work done. Why was that? Why did they behave that way? Maintenance management, schedule, structure and information. Why did they structure the work in that way? Fatigue risk management, pilots and flight crew interactions, pilot and fire rescue chief interactions, pilot behaviour. So those 3, we didn't have time to talk about those today. But essentially when the aircraft landed, the pilot had already shut down the right-hand engine, and then just before they were about to call the evacuation, the left-hand engine was still running. And so the fire chief said, you probably want to turn the left-hand engine off, which they did. But when they turned the left-hand engine off, because the radios talking to the fire chief were connected to that engine, when they shut the engine down, they immediately lost communications with the fire chief. So yeah, aircraft manufacturer change management decisions. So there was a big history of these going on. So why did the manufacturer not take more immediate action on this? What was the dynamics associated with that? We've not looked at that today, but we could. Certification requirements and technical standards. Okay, so we're at the end now. So I just want to sort of talk a little bit about near misses. So if you have an accident or a near miss or an incident, it essentially reveals that the control structure is inadequate. And I'm being very facetious when I say that's the only true root cause. But essentially, when you have a near miss or an accident, you know for a fact that there's something not right with your control structure. So you need to go and look at it. It's like it's a cheap learning opportunity, a massive learning opportunity. And of course, if nobody's been injured or killed, people are more likely to speak to you and tell you about how things really are working and not just what's in the procedure. Okay, so time. Have we got time to do a quick SWOT? Okay, so everyone's familiar with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Okay, so some strengths of the stamp-based approach, particularly CAST. So it's once you are experienced with it, I'm not saying a beginner can be good, but once you've practiced and you're getting good with it, relaxed, it can be quicker, easier, cheaper, more effective than the traditional approaches. And it also addresses the limitations with those approaches, because most of those safety approaches are all about failures. This includes consideration of failures, but it also looks at dangerous successes. It can become a demonstrably complete analysis. So the control structure model you create, if it's representative of the real system and you've analysed all of the components within the structure and the interactions, that is a demonstrably complete analysis. It can be applied very early in the life cycle, so before all of the other techniques. All the other safety techniques, you typically need to have some kind of initial design, whereas the stamp-based approaches, particularly STPA, can be applied earlier. It can enable reduction in life cycle costs, it can enable safety-guided design and operations, it can reduce safety risk, and it can uncover things. That's one of the real powerful advantages of these approaches. It can uncover things. In terms of weaknesses, so it is a challenging paradigm shift to go from managing failures to enforcing constraints and hierarchical control. So if you've been thinking about Swiss cheese all your life, when you come to think about this, it can be a bit of a tough mindset shift. It also moves from probability to possibility. So at no point during this analysis we talked about the probability of X happening or the probability of Y. We just talk about the possibility. As I mentioned, there are some challenging mental gymnastics and visualization when you first start to think about control structures. If you're not a visual person, it can be a bit of a challenge to start with, but it does get easier. It becomes a lot easier and can be very powerful. Vocabulary terminology differences. So as I highlighted with square brackets, there is a lot of English words here that are used in other safety assessment approaches, but we're talking about very specific concepts here. Information and requirements management. So you can probably see if you do this kind of analysis, you can actually generate a lot of information, a lot of valuable information, and trying to manage that can be quite a challenge. But I would say that they're not strictly stamp-based approach weaknesses. But as I said, this is still early days, and as people become more experienced and practice, they might find other challenges that need to be addressed. Opportunities, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it provides a huge competitive advantage. It's, as I mentioned, it's limited public acknowledgement due to the competitive nature of business and the challenges, sensitivities surrounding safety issues. I won't talk about the 737 MAX anymore. Huge opportunities in every industry at all stages of life cycle, not just in safety, but these approaches can be used in workplace safety, cybersecurity, training, investigation, audit and innovation. And then some threats. So it threatens traditional methods dominance, and there is a potential backlash and some roadblocks, especially part of the civil certification and safety process. Fault tree is very dominant in that arena, and so trying to integrate or introduce STPA is a big challenge. As I mentioned, probabilistic risk assessment, it does not utilise number wang. There's no comfort provided by numbers, and I'm being a bit facetious there when I say that, but ultimately this doesn't include probabilities. If you identify an unsafe control action, then that's what your design has. It's only a matter of time before that occurs. And then finally, another threat is that it uncovers things. I know it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it uncovers things that may not want to be made explicit or uncovered. Because it is very powerful when used appropriately, you can find things that people may not necessarily want to talk about. There's nowhere to hide. And that's it. So just quickly, there are some further events. As I mentioned, you can get a free copy of the book, Nancy's book, at that link on the MIT Press website. They also have a yearly event, MIT, called, the MIT Partnership for a Systems Approach to Safety website contains a lot of presentations and tutorial information. So if you want to learn more, go to that website. Nancy Leveson also hosts a lot of papers related to STAMP on her personal website as well. There is a handbook created by Nancy Leveson, the CAST handbook. So if you want to learn more about what we've talked about today, I'd suggest reading the book. My work is not based on this book because the way that I teach CAST is different to what's contained in the book, because I find, based on my experience, it's easier to teach it in an approach that I've developed as opposed to just reading the book. But you can read it. And then upcoming live events. So there's the MIT Stamp Workshop next year, end of March. That's a free event in the US, in Boston. And then in September 2020, I will be hosting the European Stamp Workshop in collaboration with the Warwick Manufacturing Group at the University of Warwick. So that was only announced last week at the European Stamp Workshop in Helsinki. So myself and my partner at the WMG will be hosting that event. So you're welcome to come along to that in September 2020. The dates have yet to be set, but when they are, I'll be sure to let you know. Oh yeah, and there's a picture from last week. So that's myself, that's Siddhartha, and then this is SaRS. So he chaired the European Stamp Workshop last week. And that's essentially it. So if you want some slide packs from various other presentations I've done, you can download them from there. If you'd like to watch the February 2016 video I did with Nancy Leveson, you can watch it there. There's a couple of hours. And if you'd like to subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can do that as well. So that's the end of the presentations, questions and answers.